Alright, ladies, so this is a less than ideal situation, but I do want to keep on with the current schedule because the reality is we don't have that much year left. So we're going to do a little review online here today, and then we'll plan to take our test next class. I also posted on Schoology there that I'll make sure that I'm available in the mornings coming up. I do have a meeting Thursday afternoon that I can't really get out of, but I'll be available in the mornings, so if anybody wants to stop by, we can talk through some things. Certainly if there's a group that wants to stop in, we can just kind of do a review session sort of thing, or just individually I can answer questions for you. But hopefully with this little video, I'll be able to get you in a pretty good place with what to expect on the test and some of the things that you want to make sure that you know going into the test. So first, let's talk about what to expect on this test. So we always kind of start our review days with formatting things. The test is worth 45 points, and it includes 28 questions. So not quite worth as much as a lot of the tests we've gotten used to taking in my class, and also not quite as long either, which is good because this is designed to fit in about an hour's time because we do have a shortened schedule on Friday. Now, in terms of the format, there are multiple choice questions, so I think it's about 19 multiple choice questions. Yeah, so 19 multiple choice. Some of those are standalone. Some of those are really similar to the homework multiple choice that you had. So definitely go back and look at that. And when I graded those on Schoology, pull those up because I hopefully always meant to circle the correct answer on those for you. So you've basically got the answer key there. Because again, a lot of these multiple choice will be really similar to ones you've seen before. And then there are a couple multiple choice that go along with pictures, which basically present a lab to you. So maybe it's a graph, maybe it's just a little illustration, and then they have a couple multiple choice questions that go along with that. Other than that, you've got, let's see, 6, we'll call them short answer questions. There's no essay on this test, but you do have these 6 questions that are sort of open-ended. You do not have to write in complete sentences for these. A couple of them do require a little bit of explanation, though, so you just got to make sure you say enough to get the point across and answer the question. But there's no long writing on this test at all. And then there are 2 questions. I guess my count is off here. 20 multiple choice. There are 2 questions which are we'll call them numbering questions. Now, this is where you have to know the sequence of events in photosynthesis and in respiration. Now, I don't expect you to be able to, off the top of your head, tell me everything that happens in photosynthesis. I mean, if this was a college course, then yeah, I'd probably have an essay that was just like, explain photosynthesis to me from start to finish. But that's not what our goal is. So what I have instead is I do want to see that you know the process. So each of these questions will have 5 steps written out, and you will number them in order. So, for instance, right, photosynthesis has to start with sunlight, right? So you will want to look for, one of the statements in the photosynthesis question will be something to the effect of photosystem 2 absorbs sunlight. So if you see that mention of sunlight, that's the first thing. And then if you think about, too, what's the ultimate goal of photosynthesis? The ultimate goal of photosynthesis is to make sugars. So you're probably going to have one of the statements for the photosynthesis question that is something like, the Calvin cycle converts carbon dioxide into carbohydrates or into sugars. And that would be the last statement. Same thing for aerobic respiration, right? The first step is always to split sugars in glycolysis, right? And the last step is always to transfer electrons over to oxygen. So, you would just number those steps, and usually it's not too hard to figure out the first and last one, but you just got to figure out the ones in between. Now, this little review video is going to run through both those processes with you again, so this will be a great way to sit down and review the processes and prepare to put those things in order. Okay. So before we really run through the metabolic pathways, let's talk for a second about some of the things in your notes that you definitely want to go back and make sure you review. First thing, what is ATP? So remember, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. This is a small energy molecule for the cell. Glucose can be converted into a bunch of ATP. And then it has a shape. This is not going to be accurate here. But it has a shape that's something like this. Right? And the big key is this part. So this is your A over here. This is just a sugar molecule. But then you got this triphosphate, right? These three phosphates. And the energy that this molecule carries is found in these phosphate bonds. So if we wanted to use this, the way that would work is we would just cut off one of these phosphate molecules, which leaves us with something called ADP, right? But by removing this phosphate, we're able to free up the energy that our cell can then use to do whatever it needs to do. Maybe it's a cell that's in charge of making hormones in your body, or maybe it's a muscle cell that's in charge of moving parts of your body. But that's what this free energy is for, and that free energy is stored in these phosphate bonds. Okay, let's see. Another thing that we mentioned is ATP totals, right, or total ATP. Remember that aerobic respiration will give you 36 total ATP. And unfortunately, that's just a number you want to kind of memorize. Because what I'm going to probably ask you to do is sort of a conversion for me. If I tell you how much glucose a food gives you, you could tell me how many ATP your cells could get from that food. Because this is 36 total ATP per glucose. So let's say that I tell you that you eat a Tic Tac, and that equals 100 glucose molecules. Then my question could be, how many ATP would you get from that? So you would just take your glucose number, right, 100 glucose, times 36 ATP for each glucose, would mean that the Tic Tac could give you 3,600 ATP. So essentially, it's not a complicated math question. It's just, can you convert between glucose and ATP? And the way to do that is to remember that you get 36 ATP per glucose. Another thing that you want to remember was one of your homework questions, and that was, why are plants green? So remember that when you see color, it's all about pigments. For plants, but really for anything else too. And the way that works is a pigment will absorb some colors of light and will reflect some colors of light. So whatever a pigment absorbs, you don't see. Think of it as though it absorbs it so it disappears. Whatever a pigment reflects, you do see. So in the case of plants, right, chlorophyll absorbs blue and red, also like violet, right, oranges, yellows, and what it reflects is green. So when you look at a plant, you see green because of that chlorophyll. But we can also apply this to any kind of situation, right? If something were to absorb blue and green and purple, then it would reflect red and you would see red, right? So this is how you really see color in anything, and it's all thanks to pigments and this absorption and reflection idea. A couple other things to make sure you look into. You want to make sure you look at that one slide that had Channing Tatum on it, which talked about things that affect photosynthesis. So remember, water, sunlight, and temperature are all factors that will increase or decrease photosynthesis. Also, don't forget to look at sort of what we did in the lab. Not that you need to know details about our actual lab that much, but remember, if we do anaerobic respiration, that means we do fermentation. CO2 bubbles are what then cause your dough to rise because your dough traps the carbon dioxide gas in there. You also make that alcohol byproduct, which you can smell, but that evaporates out of the dough when you bake it. And that's about it. But just make sure you have those ideas of anaerobic respiration in mind as well. All right, so then let's spend our last few minutes here looking at the actual metabolic processes that we have. So we'll start with photosynthesis. And if you recall, photosynthesis involves two sets of reactions. You've got the light-dependent reactions, and we'll make it black here. We got the light-independent reactions, so not requiring light. So again, photosynthesis always starts with sunlight, right? And that sunlight can be absorbed by a photosystem, which is just a bunch of chlorophyll, right? And this first one is called photosystem 2. All right, so those chlorophyll molecules are going to absorb the sunlight, that solar energy, and they're able to transfer that solar energy over to electrons, which excites the electron, moves it to this higher energy state. This is why plants are unique. I mean, our cells can't do that, right? They can't really take solar energy and sort of place it into electrons like that. Now then the electrons are passed down an electron transport chain, which is just a series of proteins that will move that electron to a second photosystem called photosystem 1. which is able to re-excite our electron and hand that electron over to an electron carrier called NADPH. All right, so that's following our electrons. The only piece that we need to sort of add in there is remember that plants also need water, right? And the reason they need water is they will split that water into oxygen and hydrogen, and when they do that, it will sort of replenish the electrons of our photosystems. So in other words, the plant can only do photosynthesis if it has electrons and it gets the electrons from water. Now the other thing that you got to remember that is going on here is that the electron transport chain is actually lodged in a membrane. And each of these proteins that move the electrons, their actual job is not to move the electrons. I mean, that's not really the goal. Their goal is to move hydrogen. So you might think, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But really, that's the point of what we're doing here is we want to make ATP. Right, so these proteins, as they move the electrons basically just give them the energy to move hydrogen across this membrane. And what this does is it builds up more hydrogen on this side, so it builds up a gradient, so that the hydrogen wants to diffuse back to this side. Now, in order to do that, it needs to pass through a channel. And that channel is an enzyme called ATP synthase. And what this enzyme does is it generates ATP as the hydrogen moves through it. So it's not that the hydrogen becomes the ATP or anything like that. It's literally that the hydrogen, as it moves through, sort of turns or rotates the ATP synthase. And with every rotation, ATP synthase is able to create some ATP. Now, I know that's complex, but that takes care of your light-dependent reactions. Then you've got the light-independent reactions. Now, light-independent reactions can be pretty complicated, but not really for us. All I want you to know about the light-independent reactions is that the plant is going to take CO2 gas, and it is going to go through a cycle, so I'm going to draw a circle, and create sugars as it does that, right? Carbohydrates, carbs. So you're going to take gas, and the term we usually use is you're going to fix the gas into a solid sugar molecule. But sort of the catch here is that in order to do that, you need NADPH, which carries electrons that have a lot of energy, and you need ATP to power that process. So these two things are essentially giving us the energy we need to power the production of sugars. And then don't forget, we have an overall summary equation, right, which is that we can take 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water to give rise to a glucose molecule and 6 oxygen molecules. In order for that to function, we need light energy. So if we identify those pieces out here, right, here's the carbon dioxide reactant, here's the water reactant down here, here's the sugar that we produce, here's the oxygen that we produce. Now, you wouldn't need to be able to write this from scratch or anything like that, but it definitely could be in a multiple choice question, and you got to be able to recognize which one is the correct formula for photosynthesis. Okay, and now respiration. So we're going to start with this basic flow chart. If you know the basic flow chart, you're going to be in great shape for the test, because this at least will give you the basis for the sequence of events that occur. So glycolysis is always first. All right, you saw this on your flow chart homework assignment too, basically. After glycolysis, if you have oxygen, you go to the Krebs cycle. If you don't have oxygen, the cell would go to fermentation. Now then, back to the oxygen side, there is that third step, the electron transport chain, that comes after the Krebs cycle. So if you were asked, what happens in aerobic respiration, that would be these three steps: glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain. If you were asked what happens in anaerobic respiration, that would be these two steps: glycolysis and fermentation. Now, a couple other things that are really important to remember. The electron transport chain is where we make the most ATP out of all of these things. And on the opposite end, fermentation is where we make no ATP directly. And so again, if we talk totals, aerobic respiration gives you 36 ATP. That's going to be 2 from glycolysis, 2 from the Krebs cycle, 32 from the electron transport chain. Anaerobic respiration really only gives you 2 ATP, because that's, again, the 2 that you get in glycolysis, and then you don't get anything for fermentation. Now, let's break down aerobic respiration a little bit more with a little more detail to it. So if we're looking at aerobic respiration. So first, let's go with our summary reaction here. Remember, this one is the opposite of photosynthesis. So we've got glucose plus 6 oxygen molecules gives rise to 6 carbon dioxides. Wow, that's ugly. Plus 6 water plus ATP energy. So our goal is to make ATP when we do aerobic respiration. So we'll start again with step 1 was glycolysis. And if you recall this word, glycolysis, it means to split sugar. So we're going to start with glucose, which is a 6 carbon molecule. And we're going to break that into 2 pyruvic acids. So we got pyruvic acid, and those both contain 3 carbons, because we've just split that sugar in half. Now, as part of that process, remember that we make a couple of things. First, recall that we had to invest 2 ATP to get this process going, but then we receive 4 ATP for doing it. So what we say is that this net total for glycolysis is that we make 4 ATP, but we spend 2 ATP to start, so we get 2 ATP out of the process. And the other thing to recall is that when we do this, we also are going to free up some electrons and put them into an electron carrier, which is just like the photosynthesis one, except the name is slightly different, and the name of this is NADH instead of NADPH. So that's glycolysis. All right, now, what happens next is each of the pyruvic acids, so we're going to follow one. All right, we'll go into the Krebs cycle. And while glycolysis took place out in the cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle takes place in your mitochondria. So pyruvic acid comes over to the mitochondria. So pyruvic acid has 3 carbons, and basically right away this gets converted into something called acetyl-CoA, which has 2 carbons. And the way that it does that is by losing a CO2 molecule. So that CO2 is breathed out, basically, all right, from your body. Now the Krebs cycle, like we said, is a cyclical thing. All right, so it goes around and around and around and around. The only step that you need to know from the Krebs cycle is that right at the beginning, a molecule that has 4 carbons, which you don't need to know the name of, is added to acetyl-CoA to form citric acid, which has 6 carbons. Then citric acid goes through a series of steps here along this cycle that gets rid of 2 of our CO2. Right, the 2 CO2s that came in as acetyl-CoA. Right, those get removed, and then that leaves us with 4 carbons, so we can do the cycle over again. Now, also during this time, we make a couple ATP, and we make more electron carriers. So we've got NADH to fill up, and then we've got something just like NADH called FADH2. A little different name, but it does the same thing, where we put some electrons in place. So that's your first 2 steps, glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. And notice what we've accomplished, right? We've broken down the sugar completely. So coming up to our formula again, we've used our sugar, and it's essentially gone. And we've turned that sugar into carbon dioxides here. And now I know I only have 3 carbon dioxides here in this picture, but realize that both pyruvic acids would have to come over and go through this Krebs cycle. So if both pyruvic acids run through the cycle, that's going to give us 6 carbon dioxides in the end. Now we've made a little bit of ATP, but not much, and we've created these electron carriers. So at the end of the Krebs cycle, we are left with these electron carriers carrying these really high potential energy electrons. So what do? We take those electron carriers and we send them to the electron transport chain. So let's go there. Now the electron transport chain, the 3rd step of cellular or aerobic respiration, is also in the mitochondria. And it is just like the one that we saw in photosynthesis, with just a couple of little exceptions. So it's the series of proteins lodged in a membrane inside the mitochondrion. And those electron carriers, NADH, FADH2, they will bring their electrons and drop them off to the electron transport chain. Each protein just passes those electrons on to the next, until at the end, instead of making NADPH like we made in photosynthesis, we have oxygen waiting as our final electron acceptor. And when we hand those electrons over to oxygen, we essentially add hydrogen to it and we get, let me back up, we get water. All right, so this is the point from our reaction where we use oxygen and we create water. Now again, the big key though is we are trying to make ATP. So this electron transport chain works just like the one from photosynthesis. We've got some hydrogen ions on one side of the membrane, and our proteins here that are part of the chain are going to move hydrogen across the membrane. Again, the only reason they do this is to build up more hydrogen over here so that hydrogen wants to move back through the membrane. But again, the only way to do that is through an enzyme called ATP synthase. And so when those hydrogens flow back through, they move the ATP synthase, and the ATP synthase makes a ton of ATP in the case of aerobic respiration. So there's our other product, or most of our other product, 36 ATP per glucose molecule. Now I know this is so much to learn, I really do. And I know that you're hating me right now, and I'm okay with that, because so many high school courses do not touch on photosynthesis and respiration at all. At Mercy, we really want to do that because we think it gives you an advantage in the future, whether it's in a college class or it's later at Mercy if you take another biology course. There's only one thing that a graduate has ever come back and thanked me for teaching them, and that's metabolism. I've had it happen somewhat frequently, but it always, I find it very interesting that students never come back and thank me for teaching them genetics or cell, mitosis or evolution or any of that stuff. But if a kid comes back and thanks me or Dr. Wong or any of us for teaching them something, it always has to do with metabolism. So I know it's tough now, but I think it'll help you in the long run. The last thing I want to say is, by no means do you need to be able to draw photosynthesis and respiration like we just did in this video. That's way beyond the scope of what we're doing. But if you could do that, or if you could at least do part of that, that would mean that you're pretty well prepared for this test, and I think you would do very well. So one of the things I challenge you to do as part of your studying is take a blank sheet of paper or take a blank screen on Notability and see what you can put together. See if you can draw out a flow chart for respiration. See if you can illustrate some of what happens in photosynthesis and kind of make it your own. And don't be ashamed if you've got to look at your notes some, right? Maybe you can kind of get started, but then you got to check something in your notes. That's fine. But to challenge yourself to do that will really allow you to kind of see where you are too, in terms of your preparation, and help you see if you really know what's going on or not. So again, I'll be around early the next couple days at school if you want to talk through this stuff. Also available via email, although that might be a little tougher to ask and answer questions about something this complex. But please don't hesitate to look me up. Good luck with your prep, and I will see you in class soon.